Okay, welcome back everybody to the 13th biennial Personalist Summer Seminar. And we've already had a number of sessions, but I'm going to ask the folks who are watching online later to understand that we are carrying on a conversation, a seminar here that's been going on for several days, and it has come time for Charles Herrman's presentation, and I want to introduce him to you guys. You've all met him already, but Charlie Herrman, I met him first, I think we figured it was 27 years ago.
Yep.
Something like that, in Oklahoma City, where he was a friend of one of my colleagues at Oklahoma City University who listened to me talk for a little while and says, there's this guy you got to meet. He's interested in a lot of the same things. That turned out to be the case. And a little bit later, he moved to Austin and spent Charles Hartshorn's last 6 or 7 years arguing with him. And Charlie has a lot of original ideas and is a fabulous partner in dialogue because he'll make something creative of something that you said that you never thought of before. This has happened to me hundreds of times in conversation with Charlie at this point. He has published a number of articles and has a book manuscript or two floating around that I expect to see the light of day before the light of date too, I suppose, before too long. And Charlie still lives in Austin, is an independent scholar, and is a senior research fellow of the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought. So with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Charlie. Please make him feel welcome.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be here. It was a long drive, but it's worthwhile. Well, let me give you an overview on the organization of the paper, because it does have parts that need to be explicated just a little bit. Half of the paper is on anthropological philosophy. The other half will be sections on Berdyaev, followed by Whitehead, then a discussion and a very short conclusion. The title of the paper is Berdyaev and Whitehead Toward a Personalist Collectivity Without Loss or Excess of Individuality. That's a topic that has begun to gain some traction in the personalist community, and I decided to go ahead and tackle it from my own point of view. That the achieving of collectivity without adequate individuality can become important was suggested by the wide popularity of sociologist William White Jr.'s 1965 book, The Organization Man. People thought they were missing out on something in the industrial community, and they got upset with the collectivism. And William White was really the answer to it, apparently. And of course, the achieving of collectivity with excessive individuality can be important, as we hear from just about every quarter. So the questions are, is society up to the task of dealing with overblown collectivism or individualism? And can collectives be arranged so as to assure individuality without risking individualism? Many other questions could, of course, have been asked, but these are the questions wherein our two authors have offered relevant input. As for individualism, there are numerous ways to go about describing it. People outside of America might point to those advantages, that those who advantage themselves of the behavioral leeways granted by the Constitution and the laws expressing it. For anybody anywhere else, it might refer to those running offices autocratically, or offices whose leaders are too weak to properly rule an office or control an office or manage it. And then for others, the word points to a very highly engaged person, including many business people, entrepreneurs, professionals, and various others. So the issue of individualism is partly innocuous and partly, in the extreme form, deleterious. So individualism covers both of those categories, and I hope that the context will provide you the option of understanding which one I mean when I use the word individualism. With regard to the apparent runaway individualism, there's my context. The thesis of this presentation is that the cause as well as the consequences are cultural. The reason that roughly 90% of the world is collective and 10% individualistic is that the very same percentages apply to our cultural makeup. 90% of the world happens to be honor-based, and 10% happens to be dignity-based. Now, before I tell you about the honor and dignity-based societies, let me tell you that I do have evidence to support the percentages I utilized. It comes from a 2022 study of the World Collectivism Index, which range from a +2 to a -2, the +2 being the most collectivistic, -2 the least, and the least collectivistic are by definition the most individualistic. So from -1 down to -2, I took all the countries in that area as individualistic, added their populations, divided by the world population, and kaboom, I got 10.4%, which rounded down to 10%. The other was 90%. So there you are. Simple as that. So I'm not making this up. Okay. So that is all to say that 10% of the world maintains a strongly held belief in both inherent rights and inherent worth, each directed at the individual. In short, they believe in inherent dignity, which in turn stresses the autonomous worth of the individual. So there's your individualism right there. The remaining 90% either do not entertain such a view or don't act as if they did. There's your honor-based. The result has turned into a cultural war, both locally and internationally. And the war which was cold is now hot, as witnessed the war in Ukraine, making this topic all the more relevant. Vladimir Putin is not high on democracy, he's not high on individualism, he's not high on our constitutional prerogatives, he's not high on anything about dignity-based. He's just not there. So that's a good portion behind the war. The premise of this paper is that we can identify either of the two main cultural types, the honor-based or the dignity-based, by looking at the formal rules defining them, or by relying on a presumed deep connection of the honor-based with collectivist, romantic, conservative, statist, and socialistic views on the one hand, and the dignity-based with individualist, enlightenment, liberal, democratic, and capitalistic views on the other. The interpretation of the relevance of any of these terms is found in the fact that they are tied together in two opposing strings of ideas. The cultural divide is thus comprehensive and it is deep. It is necessary to appreciate that the secondary dimensions, as the anthropologists will have it, are due to the cultural predominance of honor and dignity, not the other way around. Collectivities are typically corporate structures designed to do what individuals can't do on their own. Taking individualism to denote the excessive form of behavior, corporate units originally existed to govern groups and quell individualism. What collectivists do with their authority is largely up to human nature. We know from human experience that they frequently overreact and stifle individuals' needs or desires. Early bands and even early tribes were typically quite quiet cooperative societies. Emphasis was in preventing individualism, for that would disrupt and destabilize society. Clans were at once collectives and the means to control individualism. So-called professional offices were not far off, and again existed to provide rules to govern the interaction of the collective and the individuals working for or with it. Individualism versus collectivism had its origin against the backdrop of the office. Most fundamental activities of early society were in fact accomplished via offices. That includes getting the collective together to build houses for each individual who could not have done it under their own advisement, could have gotten all the materials together and so forth. So an office concept of the holder of the office and the individuals within the office get together and perform a function which is ultimately a moral function, as I will suggest later. Another variation is the agency, a collectivity of government charged with overseeing a given industry. While clearly industry requires a watchdog, nonetheless there exists a temptation to overregulate the individualist companies who have little recourse aside from changing the rules in court or appealing to congressional action, something often difficult to accomplish. In other instances, organizations can be collectives obstructing the rights of individuals to their services. This can be due to discrimination or even to a power that grants overweening prerogatives to set unfair rules that serve themselves rather than their clients. For much of this, Berdyaev blames quote-unquote legalistic ethics, whose, quote, universally binding rules lead to slavery of man to state and society, to the rich and powerful, as well to the masses, to the crowd, to the majority, unquote. Today, we are prone to blame everything on individualism. But one solution to this problem is to urge more collectivism. But the problem there is that increased collectivism can, in principle, make the problems worse as much as better, for the same reason that increasing individuality may also increase or induce more individualism. Some who by and large oppose binary analysis to begin with, like an honor-dignity binary, will shout nonsense at my association of so many very general characteristics, and what is still worse, they are all utilized within the ambit of a single binary concept. For them, I offer Berdyaev, who avers to, quote, using classicism and romanticism not as aesthetic, literary categories, but in a much wider sense as universal metaphysical categories which cover all phases of creativity, perception, moral life, and everything. I don't go that far. Culture is predicated upon honor, where trust, respect, and merited worth are the key defining elements, as well as, for many but not all, a spoken regard for the importance of honor to their culture, believe that man exists to provide for the support of the collective. Those favoring dignity where faith, acceptance, and inherent worth are the defining elements, believe that the collective or state exists to protect the rights of the citizenry or the individuals. As it happens, one of these two dispositions tends to win out in any given culture. In fact, that's pretty much almost a statement of fact. They will virtually all go one direction or the other. Call it a drift action, call it whatever you will. It just happens. A logical and reasonable way to cope with this dichotomy and its negative results is to combine traits of the two cultural types. Many cultures themselves have successfully done just that. Some Amerindian cultures have presented a fair mixture of honor-based and dignity-based traits. They typically have nature religions and grant individuals the roles they seek rather than the roles assigned, for example, along with the evidence of broad tolerance and equitable treatment of captives. The methodology that will be employed also uses the paired concepts of taste and fashion, artistic and natural beauty, as well as ethics and morality that Gadamer will help us to understand. The first of each of these stresses the individual component, but not without having to pay heed to the collective. The second of each pair is tied to the collective, but in such a way that the individual cannot be dispensed with. Honor and dignity can be handled in like fashion. These are all instances in which individualism and collectivism are typically related to one another in a normative manner. Together, these three pairs make up a not inconsiderable part of our daily lives, where cultural individualism and collectivism work well together. In a recent overview of the honor-dignity binary, I wrote the following introduction. Dignity is the backbone of honor, and honor is the face of dignity. As the backbone supports the dignity of the attached skeleton and internal organ system, so dignity supports the integrity of honor and all that it entails. Honor reflects, in certain respects, it speaks to or speaks of the dignity that secures its integrity. Dignity is quiet. The early headmen and chiefs had authority not only by virtue of their conferred honor, but also their quiet, graceful ways. Honor is active and louder by contrast. It is celebratory. It is the gift society confers on those who act in defense of group values. In some Old Norse societies, there was a bragging cup, enabling talk that would otherwise be scandalous for its apparent hubris, its loudness. The dignity-based are defined also by the legal instruments and or procedures that declare and protect citizens' rights. Apart from legal considerations, however, Christianity is the first dignity-based religion. The Christian ethics, asserts Berdyaev, is more individual than social, for the human soul is worth more than all the kingdoms of the world, unquote. He tends to exaggerate a little bit here and there. If a person or group or state carries many traits of both sides of the cultural divide, the decision as to the right label can be had by finding out where they stand on individualism, collectivism, whether they favor romanticism or classicism of the environment, and whether or not they're conservative, liberal, and so on, all those secondary dimensions. There are actually two reasons for our interest in Gadamer. First, he shows that the interactions of individualism with collectivism are ubiquitous throughout the quotidian world, and second, because the way in which they interact seems a useful method to expand into cultural affairs. He begins his treatment with the topic of taste, which has a personal side and a public side, an individual side and a collective side. Our taste is private in most instances, but it is also the case that we experience enjoyment in realizing that others, the collective, shares our taste, and we become members of a taste communion. He adds next fashion into the mix. Fashion is almost entirely objective and public or collective, whereas taste tends toward freedom of subjective individuality to propound choices and judgments. To compare the relationship between taste and fashion, which is itself a kind of taste, requires the perspective which Gadamer gives to it. Quote, thus taste is not a community sense in that it is dependent on an empirical universality, the complete unanimity of the judgments of others. Against the tyranny exercised by fashion, sure taste preserves a specific freedom and superiority. It is certain of the agreement of an ideal community. In contrast to the ruling taste by fashion, we see here the ideality of good taste, unquote. This brings out the normative relationship between the individual and the collective. There seems here to be a proper balance between them. The individual must deal with the fashion, but retains a final say-so, which is often in agreement with a similar taste community. Proceeding to natural versus artistic beauty, the beauty of nature can arouse an immediate moral interest. That is, someone having already developed an interest in the good will consequently be aroused by natural beauty. These factors led Gadamer to acknowledge that art emerges badly from the contrast with beauty, and thus, quote, Kant is right when he asserts that art must be able to be looked at as nature, unquote. Nevertheless, art is associated with the individual artist who paints landscapes that she can rest assured will find a collective market, or at least she most likely works with that in mind. Here again, artists across the cultural divide needn't argue the individualist collectivist status, since it seems to work by and large, but can even use it to discuss additional commonalities. We now arrive at the morality and ethics. Gadamer says that, quote, taste is in no way limited to what is beautiful in nature and art, but embraces the whole area of morality and manners. Taste is not the ground, but the supreme perfection of the moral judgment. The man who finds that what is going bad against his judgment, against his taste, has the greatest assurance in the acceptance of the good and the rejection of the bad, unquote. To the extent that morality always presupposes morality towards others, clearly taste is here determined in no small part by the objective other outer world of community. We forfeit a portion of autonomy in order to satisfy a collective. Here we do so with comparatively little complaint, however. Much of this paper revolves around the concept of office. The normative office represents, in my view, the ideal set of relations between individualism and collectivism. Under one perspective, the leadership of the office represents the individualist element and the office workers the collectivist. In the other, the reverse holds true. But either way, there is a relationship maintained between the two such that the normative office is very often achieved. By this I mean that the individual is not short-shrifted and the collective is not denied the ability to do its work competently. We begin with stewardship, the care and keeping of others' valuables, extended now to include our own valuables, including things such as talent. It implies a unique attitude on the part of the steward. The offices of business reflect this, and in Whitehead's words, a great society is a society in which men of business think greatly of their functions, unquote. You have to pour heart and soul into a business, as I know from my own experience at failing at it, and that attitude to a varying degree reflects every normative office. Some offices imply a calling, and one successful entrepreneur, John Mackey, out of Austin, Texas, basically accomplished nearly an ideal office setup in his Whole Foods. It can be done anywhere with a little bit of creativity and enthusiasm, especially with the concept of sincerity. I will mention that more in a little bit. The arena in which individualism and collectivism interact in helpful ways is nowhere so obvious or ubiquitous as in the office. Norman Cantor quipped that the office was Rome's greatest contribution, first observed in its military. In traditional society, the office needn't have had its modern form, but what it undoubtedly had was a care for the four basic rules to be discussed next. Black's Law Dictionary considers the office to be a platform for the exercise of authority. This is a very, very good definition, and it is right to the point. What is missing is all the flesh and bones. There are two perspectives available that can be relied upon. The first is pragmatic and applies to all of today's offices, regardless of type of function. It is constituted of four rules that any good manager has heard time and time again from a higher boss. Number one, strive for the highest quality. Number two, earn the customer's or client's trust. Number three, apply conventionally accepted standards of practice. And four, proactively avoid doing harm. The second perspective asks that we fill in some gaps with the German word Bildung. Quote, the general perspective characteristic of Bildung, remarks Gadamer, is to keep oneself open to what is other, to other more universal points of view. It embraces a general sense of proportion and distance in relationship to itself. To distance oneself and from one's private purpose means to look at these in the way others see them, unquote. This is like the, Hebrew tikkun, T-I-K-K-U-N. I believe Jim had something on that in his last presentation. It embraces a general sense of proportionate distance in relation to itself. To distance oneself from oneself, I read that, sorry about that. Again, the normative status between the individual and the collective. One could add that the mental repertoire required for the office is not a foreign element, and everyone knows of it from personal experience. Gadamer approaches stewardship most clearly when he considers the profession. Quote, practical Bildung is seen in one's fulfilling one's profession wholly in all its aspects. But this includes overcoming the element that is alien to the particularity which is oneself and making it wholly one's own. Thus, to give oneself the universality of a profession is at the same time to know how to limit oneself, i.e. to make one's profession wholly one's concern. Then it is no longer a limitation. This is the attitude we need in considering other cultures. One gives in completely. One is released into a mutual regard. It is roughly equivalent of Luther in his bondage of the will. It is Augustine's restless heart coming to rest in God's arms. Because individualism and autonomy are so much associated with dignity, it is well to open up a moment on its rise to fame or infamy. Because offices exist to accomplish what could not otherwise be accomplished, when push comes to shove, they deal with moral matters. The office makes it fairly straightforward how ethics and morality compare and contrast with one another. Effectively, ethics is what enables moral objectives. Berdyaev offers something relevant here. Quote, it may be actually said that in a sense the means which a man uses are far more important than the ends which he pursues, for they express more truly what his spirit is, unquote. This very relationship between ethics and morality, that ethics completes morality, was made good for all circumstances by Emanuel Swedenborg back in the time of Kant. In his Religion in the Making, Whitehead outlines the development of religious thought, allowing 4 stages: the ritualistic, the emotional, the belief-based, and the rationalized. These correspond to a 4-stage development of society, in particular the development of dignity. First, we have the basic honor-based unit, then we have the code of honor, followed by the code of dignity, and the normative dignity-based society in chronological order. The following few paragraphs will describe and defend this parallel line of development. In the beginning, every society required social cooperation in dealing with a difficult environment. Social stability was accordingly paramount. All must have gainful work. All must have food and shelter. These were the essentials required to ensure cooperation towards a stable society. Ritual reflected these parameters. As Whitehead put it, quote, "The practical was always there, the hard routines by which folk barely sustain life. The difference is that nature controlled them, while we now see our way to control of nature," unquote. This is the basic honor-based stage of development. These traits are still observed in many honor-based cultures, whether traditional or modern. With the advent of tribalism, we imagine bands coalescing into a tribal, clan-based system, coincident with the advent of the first actual offices. At first, only the essential offices, whether of governance, medicine, or warrioring. Society recognized the requirements that these reflect the goals of society, in part to ensure stability, in part to achieve the best results. These requirements became stewardship roles that apply to every kind of office. Whitehead's emotion took the form of sincerity, which with prerogatives and stewardship defines the office. Gadamer, explaining play, noted that we take seriously the games that we play. The equivalent to seriousness in office is sincerity. So according to Whitehead, quote, "There is no mechanical rule and no escape from the necessity of complete sincerity," unquote. Offices enabled the prerogative of those expert enough to be trusted, utilizing their personal judgment, but such was counterbalanced by the stewardship which orders the affairs of office. Both of these were enabled by sincerity. In reality, some offices are run well and some badly. A theory of culture hopes to explain these variations. The good offices are known as cults of honor, where some part of what is best in culture is sliced off, set apart, emulated, and venerated, and provided with ethics rules accordingly. Those run poorly are called cults of dignity, where dignity is shouted from the rooftops by people whose interests are entirely self-serving. Offices now enable people to possess excessive power, and with the advent of trust and beliefs, powerful persons develop mythic-based justifications for imagining that their dignity is better than others, which they lord over those others. An example from the 19th century German academe serves as heartless example. George Lucas remarks that for the crime of bringing, quote, "the nearest hint of deviation from sterile and unproductive orthodoxy," unquote, philosopher Friedrich Benecke was denied a salary teaching position. Dignity has now become the self-serving pride of orthodoxy. Dignity should be quiet. In the cult of honor, it is loud. Of course, it is not a cult because dignity is bad, but because the way dignity is expressed and exemplified in the cult is completely counter to the ideal. It is built from a slice that is best the culture can be and turned into its opposite, and then emulated as such. Whitehead describes what should, in theory, ultimately evolve from this cult. Quote, "Belief then makes its appearance as explanatory of the complex of ritual and emotion, and in this appearance of belief we may discern the germ of rationalization. Religion claims that its concepts, though derived primarily from special experience, are yet of universal validity," unquote. An example of false rationalization is the world organized for an aristocracy of raw power or perhaps a plutocracy. This is a cult of dignity. True rationalization, such as Whitehead is talking about, introduces the expansion of perspective in which we investigate the nature and extent of the motto, "My brother's keeper." What Gadamer said above is well to repeat here. To distance oneself and from one's private purpose means to look at the things the way the others see them. This prompts dignity-based ideals, the true ideals, and not the false ones of the dignity cult. Now I'm going to talk about Berdyaev. I want to discuss him as an honor-based individual subscribing to as well as prescribing what are honor-based concerns as they relate to individualism. Individuals, after all, can be typed by the same criteria no differently from cultures. Nikolai, or Nicholas Berdyaev, 1874 to 1948, showed his colors early. As of 1909, he had already announced himself as an anti-Enlightenment philosopher, chastising members of the intelligentsia for adopting wholesale European attitudes. In a publication written with 6 other writers of note, Berdyaev complained that parts of the intelligentsia placed interest above truth and humans above the divine. No romantic could have said it better. Elsewhere he says, quote, "All modern history with its rationalism, its positivism, its belief in science has been a period of night rather than of day," unquote. Romanticism is, accordingly, honor-based. It is honor-based in addition for being oriented to the collective and centered upon giving respect not only to the individual but to all of nature. Russia and its people were then and remain now both romantic and honor-based. Said Berdyaev, the fundamental contradiction in my thinking about social life is bound up with the juxtaposition in me of two elements, an aristocratic, or what we would call honor-based, interpretation of personality, freedom, and creativeness, and a socialistic demand for the assertion of dignity of every man, even of the most insignificant of men, for a guarantee of his rights to life, obviously dignity-based. This contradiction, he says, is age-long. Berdyaev points to the, quote, new ideological tendencies, active, sharp, bitter, and passionate, that often contain malice, hatred, lust for destruction, and a demonic will to victory. A little more exaggeration, but he's got the basic point right. He associates such with the early, quote-unquote, clash between romanticism and classicism. Today's equivalent is what I would call the ugly clash between honor and dignity, what they represent and portend. Where we before labeled Berdyaev as honor-based, we can now associate that he is, while nominally honor-based, infused with sufficient tenets of dignity to have attained a really marvelous composition of honor and dignity, which in this writer's view is an ideal combination for mutual understanding. Charles Hartshorne of panentheist fame was the same, except he never allowed for inherent worth. I know that because I asked him straight-facedly whether he believed in inherent worth, and he said no. Simple as that. No explanation, just no. In another leaning toward the honor base, Berdyaev says that the human personality is, quote, the highest hierarchical value in the world. That it was early in his career, apparently, for in Slavery and Freedom in 1939, he writes, personality cannot be part of any kind of hierarchical whole. Oh well. Hierarchy is also a staple among the vast majority of honor-based societies. The garden variety of social hierarchy tends to place limitations on choice and opportunity. He implies that his hierarchy is different. He goes so far as to say that, quote, individualism with all its precious qualities, individualism with all its precious qualities predicates an organic hierarchism of the world rather than leveling mechanism. Vocation and greatness in the world are possible only in the case that there is an organic hierarchy in the world. Here he borrows a little bit from Whitehead, it seems. And that's an unquote there. He evidently doesn't grasp the idea that dignity, which he does laud, is one such leveling mechanism. The due process thesis of equality before the law, which is very important to a dignity-based collective, is also an example of leveling, and not all leveling is bad, of course. Berdyaev actually thinks that it was providence which creates revolutions and not the political and social issues facing a society and by the activity of its leaders. There seems to be no such thing as personality having interactions with actual culture, but there is such a thing as personality intermingling with culture, with character. What this means is not offered. What we do know is that spirit will create personality, and somehow, with the inner voice influencing it, there is a back and forth influence between asceticism and the personality. Finally, character, says Berdyaev, presupposes an asceticism which is capable of choice and resistance. Character denotes refusal to acquiesce in slavery and repudiation of the enslaving majesty of the world, unquote. Berdyaev will say that, quote, personality is certainly not an abstract norm or idea suppressing or enslaving the concrete individual living being. The spiritual principle which constitutes personality does not imply a bloodless and abstract spiritualism, unquote. The ethics of creativity allows Matthew Spinka, quote, a vital concern for society. That sounds like absolute inherent realism. But we are asked to have simple faith that the inner voice connects with personality, which is kept healthy by the spirit, and that it is all in the direct relation to human activity within society. The realist actually sighs. Would that it were so. Whitehead, I believe, would place this in the category of, quote, unquote, religious mysticism incapable of rationalization. Man is bound, Berdyaev notes, quote, to determine his relation to society, but he cannot be morally determined by society. The socialization of morality means the tyranny of society and of public opinion over spiritual life of man and his moral valuations. The enemy of personality is the community, not communality or subornost. Elsewhere, he is still more specific. Humans possess within themselves an element of independent society. We realize ourselves within society, but we are not wholly dependent upon it, unquote. These are all more or less normative relations between individualism and collectivism. Private morality works like public taste. Public morality is like fashion, only still more powerful. In marking out the territory described by Gadamer, Berdyaev would have it that private person has some independence but is not fully autonomous from the public. There is an extent to which the ideal of society, of communality, exerts an influence over the private individual, whereas the latter is due to the identification of the individual with the communality. This would seem to be the goal of Berdyaev's personhood, and I would agree with that. That is certainly a good goal. In society today, Berdyaev would say, as he did of his own age, that work is, of course, social and takes place in a community. But from the ethical point of view, we ought to make it more individual. Partial desocialization does not in the least imply that it becomes antisocial, since social life and activity is the vocation of personality, unquote. Not only this, but private ownership of property gets Berdyaev's support to the extent that workers would otherwise become the slaves of the state. Here again, there is a back and forth between collective and individual, where each group gets something but not everything. In general, then, quote, the state must protect the social class from the tyranny of another, which has concentrated in its hands the ownership of material goods, or what comes to the same thing, the state must protect the individual. The ideal is to get rid of classes altogether and replace them by professions, unquote. Not only does this remind one of dignity-based mechanics, but it brings us straightaway to the office as the carrier of social values. In short, quote, freedom is apparently best attained through a complex of pluralistic system combining private ownership with ownership by the state and limiting both. You can be certain Berdyaev will favor protection of individuals over and against the collective. Now to Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead, 1861 to 1947, was born in England and attended Trinity College, Cambridge, uninterrupted from 1880 to 1910, where he studied mathematics almost exclusively. It is a broad but decent generalization that liberals rather than conservatives take the route toward inherent dignity for all, which included in his day and time support for women's emancipation, achieved in 1918 prior to the end of World War I. Whitehead was on the progressive side and considered himself a liberal. On his retirement from Trinity, he accepted the offer of a 5-year stint at Harvard, and America, if anything more rationalist than England, was legally the most dignity-based of all nations, if not necessarily on the social side of things. His son North remarked, quote, my father not only did not regret crossing the Atlantic, he thought it one of the best things he ever did. He genuinely loved this country and believed in it, unquote. Not exactly the typical romantic would have offered. In his writings, he at one point defends the notion of inherent worth, which we take as tantamount to inherent dignity and inherent rights. At another place, he declaims against conservatism, which is the first to shout decadence at the modernizing factors in civilization and the first also to refuse any forward change, even where evidence shows it to be the better. Aside from the irrationality of these two together, there arises the question whether strict adherence to tradition is the wisest way to conduct the policies of life. Whitehead assures us that in advance, quote, advance or decadence are the only choices offered to mankind. The pure conservative is fighting against the essence of the universe, unquote. Whitehead is accordingly dignity-based. Whitehead, a scholar in mathematical physics, said of the line of important Frenchmen in his rarefied field that, quote, it is impossible to explain intelligently in a short time and without technicalities the details of the progress made by this school, unquote. Adding the remaining philosophes to the listening, Whitehead continues this paean. Quote, we cannot overrate the debt of gratitude we owe to these men. Finally this, quote, the common sense of the 18th century, its grasp of the obvious facts of human suffering and of the obvious demands of human nature acted on the world like a bath of moral cleansing. Voltaire must have the credit. He hated injustice, he hated cruelty, he hated senseless repression, he hated hocus pocus, and furthermore, when he saw them, he knew them. In these supreme virtues, he was typical of his century on its better side. And that was stressed. From Whitehead's unique physical theory explanation, quote, the romantic reaction was a protest on behalf of value, unquote, a concept that he defines as, quote, the intrinsic reality of an event, unquote, which in turn is a unity derived from the unity of an experience, or from another point of view, the event, the quote unquote, the emergence into the actuality of something. At any rate, any investigation must start with the event as the ultimate unit of natural occurrence, unquote. And Whitehead is not unsympathetic to the romantic view, saying that, quote, the purpose of God is the attainment of value in the temporal world. Like it or not, then, Whitehead is a rationalistic, realistic, dignity-based mathematician who happens to understand and empathize with honor-based culture. Thus, as with Berdyaev and Hartshorne, we consider his posture as worthy of emulation as an ideal. In speaking of organicism, Whitehead tells us that if the organism is that of an actual entity with an eternal object, an aggregate of these organisms is a nexus called a society. If the nexus features a serial inheritance, the result is an enduring object or also a person. Whitehead was aware of the potential anthropomorphism here, as he himself mentions, and recommends quote-unquote enduring object instead, but it really acts like a person. As there is naturally occurring balance in these relations, so his ideal of individual and collectivism is likewise. In Whitehead, the person, individual, serves the body or collective, as the body serves the person. According to Cobb, quote, to a large extent, the living person sums up what is taking place in the body and functions for the sake of the well-being of the body, unquote. For Whitehead, the body or collective includes the brain and all the various bodily functions. The individual person, however, is seemingly tied to the soul, wherein Whitehead says the body and soul are, quote-unquote, fused together, though the common language allows the person as tantamount to the body. Elsewhere, his definitions require that, quote-unquote, man is a person. Apparently, his metaphysics allows the person to act through the brain and onto the rest of the body. The brain's purpose is to inform the person of the risks and benefits of acting or not, and the person serves the body by serving the brain. Here, if correct, and if my interpretation is correct, Whitehead has demonstrated an individual-collective relation by providing both directions equally. But we can be still more specific. It seems that the most important of his popular reflections implying similar patterns for individual and collective is found in the Adventures of Ideas. This is a somewhat longish quote, but I thought it was necessary to get his point across. Apart from life of a high grade of mentality in individual occasions seems to be impossible. A personal society, or individual as I would call it, itself living and dominantly influencing a living society wider than itself, a collective I would call it, is the only type of organization which produces occasions of high-grade mentality. Thus, in a man, the living body is permeated by living societies of low-grade occasions so far as mentality is concerned, but the whole, or collective, is coordinated so to support a personal living society, or individual, of high-grade occasions. This personal society is the man defined as person. Unquote. If what generates the person parallels the individual collective, we have here a model of the fundamental characteristics of any office. The full gist of the passage appears to be, if I am correct, that to be without the collective or coordination of a wide living society, there would be no high-grade occasions. Here the collective influences the individuals, but a high-grade individual society can dominantly influence the collective. In the office, the ethical rules and the leading officers generate or hire high-grade actors, individuals, whose talents dominantly influence the collective office itself, which is precisely how it should be. The individuals and collective work hand in hand to produce the moral product expected of the wider public. In society, organism's most potent representative is the group. A class of actual representations of the excerpt above is also found in the Adventures of Ideas. Quote, groups should contribute to the complex pattern of community life, each in virtue of its own particularity. In this way, individuality gains the effectiveness which issues from coordination, and freedom obtains power necessary for its perfection, unquote. Thus, individualism interacts with the collective forces, and together they forge practical polity. This is the essence of any normative office. Whitehead dealt in one manner or another with all three of Gadamer's pairings. In each case, he presents circumstances which compel individualism to mesh with the collective elements of sociality, not so differently from how Gadamer handled them. The general backdrop to these individualist-collectivist interactions is enabled, it seems, by what follows, using art as a model. Quote, the canons of art, Whitehead said, are merely the expressive, in specialized forms, of the requisites for depth of experience. The principles of morality are allied to the canons of art in that they also express in another connection the same requisites. Owing to the principle that contemporary actual entities occur in relative independence, the nexus of contemporary actual entities are particularly favorable for this transference of systematic qualities from other nexus to themselves. Here again, a normative individualist-collectivist relation seems to hold. Whitehead speaks of religion as follows. Quote, it can either be considered from the point of view of the mutual relations of its parts to each other, or, he continues, it can be considered from the point of view of its impact as a unity upon the experience of an external percipient. Thirdly, the percipient may be an occasion within the region and may yet grasp the region as one, including the percipient itself as a member of it, unquote. The first and second points are illustrated in two of his examples. The orchestra is loud as one entity, and also in virtue of the perceived loudness of the individual members of their musical instruments. The discipline of a regiment inheres in the regiment in a different mode from its inherence in the individual soldiers. The association of a nexus in one with a quality will be in general a mode of exemplification which differs from the mode on which the respective individual is illustrated, unquote. In each case, the orchestra or regiment can have an impact on an external percipient, think of the client to the office. The third point, again, where a percipient will yet, quote unquote, grasp the region as one, including the percipient itself as a member of it, quote unquote, is illustrated by any office. Here is an example from Whitehead. Quote, it belongs to the essence of each occasion of experience that it is concerned with an otherwise transcending self. The occasion is one among others and including the others with which it is among, unquote. Not only that, but in the transcendence we see the basis of Bildung and therefore stewardship as well. But he offers an interesting example where a work of art, modeling what we can call a normative office, and where the actual occasions provide the individuals and the collective. Quote, the basis of a strong penetrating experience of harmony is an appearance with a foreground of enduring individuals and a background of undiscriminated occasions. The very details of its compositions live supremely in their own right. They make their own claim to originality and yet contribute to the whole. Each such detail receives an access of grandeur from the whole and yet manifests an individuality claiming attention, unquote. These varied examples have established three things, I believe, if I've interpreted them correctly. The disposition of groups to take in information from others. Second, the presence of rules. And third, the relation of individualities to the collectives, both where the former is a component of the latter and where it isn't. In the end, what comes through is that the collective may extend only so far. The individuals must be accounted for and respected for their services. In Berdyaev's system, this is now in the discussion section, starting with Berdyaev. In Berdyaev's system, these stages, the honor-based, code of honor, code of dignity, and dignity-based, are transitions suggesting some relations from the three pairs we introduced above from Gadamer. Where the pairings dealt with individual collective relations, Berdyaev now introduces relations between man and the divine. These new pairings carry implications for both ideal and real relations between self and community. Specifically, they deal with the frame of mind required to escape from the code of dignity and progress to the true dignity-based society, from the code of honor to the dignity-based, but with a twist. It is, as one will expect, a mystery, and here is Berdyaev to explain. The expression of this mystery reflects an experience of the process of transcendence, of falling into an abyss, the code of dignity, and of escaping from that abyss into a code of honor. The dignity is that which transcends man, and the divine is mysteriously united with the human in the divine human image. Man is not only the image of the world, he is also the image of God. Within him, conflict between the God and the world and God, conflict between the world and God takes place. He is a being both independent and free. The necessary condition entails a collective as well as individual, partly dependent on it and partly free of it. In the true state of dignity, we do not perceive the function of the office in terms of a means-end relationship of a moral purpose. We see the entire process as one of ideal relationships of stewardship with Bildung, in which the ethical means is always an ideal in itself, that the person exists in a higher state with respect to objective reality while pursuing her directed activities, always seeing the actions as moral, not just as ethical. But what is the solution to our social problems? Berdyaev offers a short but direct answer. The social problem is solved by improving the life of the masses, by engaging them in creative activity, raising them up and increasing the significance of labor, but not by giving them the mastery and letting power rest with the collective as a whole, unquote. Here is the relevance of the individual's collectivist issue. And what can each of us do? The answer, quote, cultivate in yourself a pure and original conscience, discipline your personality, struggle with evil in yourself, and surround you to conquer evil, and to further a creative regeneration of the wicked, unquote. In pragmatic terms, it boils down to the office of chivalry, with loyalty to a cause and with those whose worth requires and demands our regard and respect. Berdyaev's Overman Berdyaev's Overman, less the arrogance and hubris, is the last subsection within this. Berdyaev has constructed a system that parallels Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Quote, knowledge requires great daring. He who stops to reflect or he who doubts cannot be active in the world. He cannot be a warrior. He who creates is always dogmatic. He dares to make a choice and then asserts it. Critical scientific philosophy does not want to be dangerously in love. Creative philosophy is an act knowing love and not a science of knowing family, comfort, and order. Philosophy is man's self-consciousness of his imperial and creative role in the universe. In supporting Renaissance, that's unquote. In supporting Renaissance individualism, Berdyaev sidestepped all of the individual shenanigans of the Italian city-states of the period, a time when individualism was as rampant as during the era of scientism to which Berdyaev was witness. He often remarks of the necessity for the individual to have near plenary powers in order to hold the balance with the collective. How different really is this description from today's America. In all seriousness, Do we need perhaps still more individualism? In addition, his approach is assuredly aristocratic, as he oftentimes asserted. What could be worse, I would ask, than a stuck-up Zarathustrian individualist? Harry Nelson Weeman, for one, stood in opposition to any system characterized by, quote, a high peak of creative transformation which will continue to soar far above the mass of people, with only a few finding a place there, unquote. Recall that his individualism, presupposing it were based in true creativity, could in principle run rampant, and Berdyaev would simply look the other way, as he apparently did with the Renaissance. We might find it difficult to obtain from Berdyaev a realistic resolution of the problem of individualism any more than we could place our trust in Zarathustra. What if the answer is for the working class to assert individualism through participation in unions? Of course, progressives will agree wholeheartedly, and I believe Berdyaev would agree as well. It is what he prescribes for those not creative that is of concern to a realist. For that, Berdyaev is notably lacking in realistic solutions, at least it seems to me. For Whitehead, he is convinced, according to Plato, that communication between individuals and between groups is of two possible forms, force or persuasion. He offers commerce as the leading example of the latter. I believe that the better concept is that of the office, which all commerce relies upon, even down to the haggling. Provide the quality which people expect at a given level of value, assure trustworthiness of product and price, utilize traditional values of interchange, and proactively avoid false measurements and so forth. Commerce is constructed from the rules that run the office. Regarding the cooperative or comparative influence of the cooperative and individual components, Whitehead offers this. The compulsory dominion of man over man has a double significance. It has a benign effect insofar as it secures the coordination of behavior necessary for social welfare, but it is fatal to extend this dominion beyond the barest limits necessary for this coordination. This can be taken as a leitmotif of Whitehead's opinion on the value of individuals of the individual relative to the collective. In conclusion, is society up to the task of dealing with overblown collectivism or individualism? Can collectives be arranged so as to assure individuality without risking individualism? From the ideal perspective, Berdyaev answers yes, but that presumes manifest success in converting the bourgeois to genuine freedom and correctivity, which will have pretty little practical result if one must fully identify with God, but will be much more likely if one's success relies only or mainly on love and empathy toward others. Absent that, he is certain the answer is negative in both regards, for that leaves us with a bourgeois lifestyle with runaway individualism. But he is radically inconsistent. Laborers should demand unions, but other displays of individualism are anathema for being bourgeois. Whitehead's answer seems more nuanced. At issue is whether he really feels that individualism is an actual problem. He spends very little time excoriating issues we associate with rampant individualism. Either way, his answer is to prohibit collectives' power to exercise more than nominally necessary authority over individuals. Berdyaev seems wholeheartedly to agree. These are the same answers that would be reported were we concerned to avoid excess individualism as opposed to inadequate individualism. I believe that each of these authors would reckon the normative office as the ideal. Thank you.
That went by quickly. We'll have some time for some questions. I say it went by quickly. What I mean is you read very quickly. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and say what you mean by the office is what Thomas Jefferson meant by the habits of liberty. And part of the reason, I mean, it's got an ugly background, as so many things with Jefferson do. You can't get more individualistic than Jefferson, right?
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, one of the contexts in which he used that phrase, the habits of liberty, was in his advice to Lewis and Clark about how to give plows to the Indians that they were going to encounter along the way. He said that first they have to have the argument about private property.
Oh boy.
And that giving them plows would do that. And then they would gradually develop the habits of liberty. In other words, it's not that far from Kant as individualist when he's speaking about collective war and the effect of war on the development of civilization and history, except that Jefferson is thinking about it as a dignity thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, whereas Kant was
Quote,
thinking
unquote.
about it, this is so it's problematic. There's a reason I need this question out here, is because I thought about that when the Soviet Union broke up, and I thought these guys don't have the habits of liberty, and that is going to be a problem.
That's right.
And so it's a purely honor-based society. And the habits of what Jefferson meant by the habits of liberty, though, is something that is deeply ingrained in the idea of private property.
From Locke on to the present.
Yeah, from Locke to the present. And so private property is given a new interpretation with Locke.
Right.
And I guess we're going to hear a little more about Locke here in a few minutes, or an hour or two. But anyway, the office would soften that sort of libertarian reading of individualism, right?
Yes.
Okay, how? How would that work? So what should Thomas Jefferson have said to Lewis and Clark?
He should have told them to do as in Rome as the Romans do.
and so, in other words, we should learn who our fellow citizens are going to be, instead of make them like us.
Right. The habits of liberty shouldn't be assimilated in that way.
Well, but
in fact, dignity demands that you give them their prerogatives as a culture.
One of the funny things is, and you said this at the beginning of your paper, Native Americans were already individualistic.
In many cases, yes.
But it was an individualism that's closer to what you mean by the office than the habits of liberty.
Right.
So there's this sliding scale, right?
Yeah.
Of if you've got a dignity based culture, chances are you need to move in the direction of honor, and if you've got an honor based culture,
And
chances
my
are
basic
you
leitmotif is that the purpose of all of this is basically to encourage dignity-based peoples to listen to the honor-based societies and actually emulate some of their traits, and the reverse should also be in the case.
That's
For
all
example,
it is.
honor-based cultures could do with a little bit more due process, for example, and we could do with a lot more comedy and less seriousness over the fact that we have a finite lifespan. The Indians were almost oblivious to that kind of an argument. They took it as a part of nature.
We are litigious, and they negotiated.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, yeah.
Right.
Matthew?
So we'll start in on kind of picking up on that litigious point, and as a point of praise, just to say that I wish some of my former colleagues who had been educated as military officers at West Point had a better sense of the point that you're making in this case. I think we would have had, at least in Iraq, fewer petty war criminals like Eddie's Gallagher and Clint Lawrence and things like that, or perhaps large ones in the offices of, Donald Rumsfeld and so on, where there's a lack of a sense of stewardship, I think would fit well within the sense of where you're talking about how the cult of dignity inverts and reverses it. I think there's a sense of stewardship that comes along with the sense of office. Same with haggling, same with the business office that you're
He's
talking
written an
about.
entire book about this.
Okay,
And
cool.
that's the word he uses too.
Okay, cool. So we're on the same page.
Yeah.
And this kind of biographical point from me saying that I could give you days of first-hand examples of good and bad officers, borrowed directly from Rome in a military setting, examples of the good and the bad living up to that officership and not. Rather than thinking litigiously on what can I get away with, what can I do, what can be permissive, what are we allowed to do. Again, all the way up to engaging in
As
wars of
Pliny
choice.
of the Younger suggested, do not press the envelope.
Yeah. But
Well, that's what Jefferson should have said too,
That's
right?
right.
Okay.
That's right.
so this biographical little aside leads me to a more Whiteheadian and metaphysical question, which is when we look at exemplars of officership, of excellence in office, military, commercial, personal, that self-creation that you talk about, is it fair to say that there's a sense in which honor and dignity, both, because we have to strike a balance as we just discussed, are ingressions of an eternal object of some kind? Because if we look at like historical examples of great officers, Band of Brothers kind of stuff, these aren't people who had 4 years of training. A lot of the self-made businessmen who are great officers of that they didn't go to Wharton for 4 years or something like that, but rather it's that they are the culmination of a product, I think you would agree, that emphasizes this sense of honor, this sense of stewardship. Is that a function of an ingression of a Whiteheadian eternal object or set of eternal objects into the person?
Cluster of eternal.
Cluster.
Okay.
There we
Well,
go.
let me take up the cluster thing, but I'm going to put my own spin on it. With due respect to Whitehead, if I cross his path the wrong way, to me, the idea of Bildung and tikkun in Hebrew means going beyond yourself, and that means taking your personality beyond your body to incorporate similar things that we can call clusters, to take in dignity-based and honor-based principles alike as clusters.
Okay.
Now, taking them in may or may not qualify as an ingression. I'm not an expert enough in Whiteheadian philosophy to know whether that qualifies as an ingression or not, but if it is, then yes.
And
I would say
sometimes
that.
it's mediated in different ways in different degrees.
But to me, the whole idea of the office is that you think above yourself. You think beyond yourself. You think of others. You think of the job. You think of the moral task that you're involved in. You think of the ethics on the way to that moral consummation. You're always going beyond in all of these different ways of thinking, and that means you're spreading yourself out and prehending all these different things into clusters, and these clusters are what build your spirit into stewardship and Bildung.
Sounds like a generic contrast to me.
That's the answer I suspected you'd give, but I'm glad that you confirmed that. Thank you.
George?
And just to continue on Matt's excellent example and theme there, in military settings, an honor culture, first, the word honor is not a dirty word.
Right.
It's overemphasized and poorly understood, but elevated.
And sometimes takes the place of where we would actually say this cult of dignity.
The cult of dignity.
Exactly.
Yes,
That
yes.
is sometimes what happens.
That's what happens. So the dialectic is skewed in that sense.
Yeah.
And
And I would also point out that the cult of dignity grew out of the cult of honor, because there tends to be a process in honor. Schilling said something to the effect of at some point people in office tend to lose their what I would call stewardship characteristics and start losing the effort to maintain the holistic stewardship aspects of the office and decline and start getting corrupt in various ways, and the office goes down the hill. He said that was universal in its operation, and I think that he's probably got a point there.
that it's inevitable.
That is inevitable. And so you start with a cult of honor, and even within the honor-based society, it starts going into a cult of dignity. And then our job as dignity-based people is to get out of that cult of dignity and get real honor, get real dignity. And to do that, you have to go back to the honor-based cultures and observe that what they do as a matter of expediency is what we should hold as ideals.
Right.
In other words, health care for everybody.
Right.
Everybody has gainful employment. Everybody has this and that and the others. The same thing that the honor-based cultures took as an automatic requirement in order to maintain stability, we should have as ideals and fight for those ideals as dignity-based individuals.
Again, that's the dialectical relationship between those two conceptions, constantly tuning one
Yeah, and that's the other part of my
Correct.
ultimate
Yeah.
motif.
But what I had wanted to say was the language used, and not just the language of honor, but get back to Matt's point that you have these litigious individuals holding office and thinking either about honor as a quality of character of the individual instead of a property of the collective.
I'm
And
sorry, you said instead of a property of what?
the collective.
Okay, thank you.
And we talk about it in terms of, well, leadership and command climate and things like that are metaphors that are widely used to talk about the way in which the officer's personality extends, as you put it, beyond himself or herself and infuses the collective and creates an atmosphere in which either the subordinate members and individuals can be enabled or their individualism suppressed and destroyed in what we call a toxic command climate,
Right.
which was so often the problem, the practical problem that Matt points to. And these kinds of the dialectical relationships sort of help you think. They temper honor with individuality, with the habits of freedom, with if they can be understood and implemented in organizational life. Very hard to do,
Yeah.
but I think you've mapped that out very nicely.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, let me apologize for going through it kind of quickly. I went through the original manuscript and it took over an hour. And so I started slicing. And I thought that I probably hadn't sliced enough, so I decided I better get this in and get it done within a half hour.
You were a good steward.
I tried. What did I say?
You've really helped me with understanding. You know, I spend a lot of time in Poland, very much an honor-based culture, but they love the dignity, they love the individualism of the United States. They love the United States above all things except themselves. And so they wish they could be like us and don't understand why they can't. And of course, I spent enough time over there to say, you don't really want to be like us.
Right.
And that's an example of a
As
place.
a matter of fact, they may actually have that combination of honor-based and dignity-based traits that's the ideal.
I think it's close to it. I tell them how well off they are, because it would never occur to them that giving a mother or father, they can choose, a year off after the birth of a child at full pay, that was any kind of, that was any kind of weakness. That's a strength, or that universal health care was, namby-pamby. I mean, they seem like a nationalistic sort of right-wing government. No, by our standards, they're screaming socialists, except that it's about the presuppositions of a very, what you might call, tight, conservative, and homogeneous culture that's honor-based. Of course you're going to take care of your own. This we do not do in the United States, and so and yet they idolize and in many ways emulate the individualism.
Well, that's like many, not many perhaps, but in a number of traditional societies, the Eskimos, the Maya, they are much more individualistic than the usual honor-based society, and this is something that may be along the lines that you're talking about.
I like your description of leadership in that conception, where the tribal leader elevated is not done so by a virtue of power and personality.
Yeah, as a matter of fact,
gentleness.
a fellow named Miller wrote a paper called "The Two Methods of Authority."
Yeah.
It came out in American Anthropologist at some point, and the one that I associate with dignity was the authority that is by respect,
Right.
not the authority that comes to it by power.
Right.
In fact, if
Sounds like
you manage your authority by way of power, you would be taken out of office pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
Not
Relational
necessarily in a
versus
dignity
coercive.
cult, though.
That's right.
In a dignity cult, that kind of behavior gets rewarded.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
Wow.
Melissa?
It's going to be hard for me to put this out there.
Go for it.
So, In a world where we have this new cult of dignity around fair trade markets and responsible sustainability practices and whatnot, how does one put limits on what is considered the collective and that honor system in a world that's so global, and while still dealing with the class struggles we have? I feel like if you're poor and you can't afford to buy fair trade products, so you're somehow interfering with the dignity of someone on the other side of the planet, and who knows what kind of life they have because you chose to buy something, that
Folgers.
whatever, right? But if you pay for the fair trade coffee and now you can't afford to do your laundry this week at the laundromat and you end up being stinky for work, now your dignity is being affected, your sense of self-respect. And so in a world where we have kind of this loop where if you're poor, you're buying on Amazon and potentially destroying the dignity of someone on the other side of the planet you'll never meet, but you're trapped in this cycle because that's all you can afford. You can't afford to be a part of the dignified cult that's buying everything responsibly. And how much money does it take to be part of that cult? How can you possibly have dignity on either side, the person you're buying the thing from or yourself?
Well, let me give a two-part answer. First, they should read my book.
The stewardship book.
The
Yeah.
stewardship book. But second of all, everybody considers that they have some dignity, and in a dignity-based society, that is the top term. If you ask people whether they had dignity or honor, they would say dignity, hands down, in a dignity-based society, our society in particular. So the issue becomes: is it my dignity or somebody else's dignity that I'm interested in? Well, that's for you to decide. It's not for me to decide. It's for you to decide. And that is part of your dignity, is making that decision. Do I spread my wings out and help somebody else at the expense of my own dignity, or do I not? That's your decision, and no one's going to argue with you. It is your decision to make.
I just have to make
I
it with
cannot
the
tell you
entire
how
world.
to answer that question.
I have to consider the entire world when I make the decision. The
Well,
welfare of everyone.
if you're going to take dignity to its furthest degree, what I'm suggesting is that you not probably do that. I would suggest that you find an in-between with where you're comfortable with your own dignity, and that means you're comfortable with what you can afford, that allows you to have the lifestyle that you feel that you can work with, while at the same time offering something to others.
So there's a sense in which cosmopolitan dignity goes too far?
If you, well, I mean, it's possible to take it too far. I mean, if you go into poverty, trying to help somebody
Sure.
get out of poverty, most
Sure.
people would say that's going too far.
Sure.
And I would be one of them.
Yeah.
Jim,
Thanks, I enjoyed the paper quite a bit. And
thank you.
on Berdyaev's philosophy of culture, you're absolutely right. He makes these great universal statements.
Yeah.
And
I had a lot of smiles reading through the book.
the Russian mind, the German mind, stuff you don't hear. But this is a very, very brief question and trivial. Okay.
I'm sorry. the
Trivial.
last one. Trivial. Oh, okay.
You were going reading through the paper. You mentioned Swedenborg, and I missed the connection.
Oh, the Hebrew word tikkun?
No, Swedenborg.
Swedenborg.
Oh, Swedenborg. Swedenborg. Yes, Emanuel Swedenborg. He was
Yeah, I know who he was. But
Oh, okay.
How did you make the connection?
How did I make the connection?
Yeah, what were you saying about him? 'Cause I missed it.
Something with.
Oh, okay. He thought that the purpose of ethics was to ensure that morality was consummated. Ethics served the purpose of morality. Okay.
All right, Danica, you had a question.
It was
Last
more-
one.
It was more of a comment. I'll say for sake of time.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, with that said, we need to move on. Thank you.